Itachi's first-hand experience in fatal combat was at the Great Ninja War, when his father insists that it's not a war between people, but a war between nations. In the sense, it's a statement that seems innocuous and obvious, but with further reading, it's one that highlights Itachi's role as a shinobi, his role as a tool. Even wars between nations are fought by people. It is people who feel the desire to fight and create the circumstances necessary for wars to occur. And thus, by removing the human element out of the equation, shinobi become agents of complacency. To become a tool to be used for the good of those above him, Itachi had to shed his own sense of self just to fulfill that role. To Orochimaru, he questioned the meaning of life, but his questions were unanswered. Unable to receive an answer which satisfied his curiosity from one who discarded such fallacies in his desire for immortality, he was never treated as the child he was, his youth always secondary to his genius. His peers saw him as something above, either too enthralled by his talent or too envious of his accomplishments, so the world kept its distance, to such an extent that he only found solace in little Sasuke, human connection from Shisui, and minor concessions from Izumi. Isolation is the cost of genius, and it was in that genius and isolation that Itachi would become the perfect tool. His accomplishments were a source of pride for the Uchiha, his father viewing him as proof of the Uchiha's future prosperity. Though they did recognize him, they never understood him, believing his isolation to be a result of his superiority as opposed to his dissatisfaction with the shinobi's life of unending conflict. His classmates revered him without questioning that within the depths of his immense strength, there were deep flaws that kept him from finding his place in the world, and in not seeing him, he was further isolated. When Fugaku conspired against the Leaf, Itachi knew that such an act would lead to another great war. As such, he sought a peaceful solution to the conflict, but it was constantly rebuked in his efforts. After all, it wasn't a war between people, but a war between nations, and a war between nations leads to an endless cycle of hatred and death. This idea of hatred and death is one evoked even in his name, Itachi, literally meaning weasel. In Japanese legend, weasels are seen as an omen of bad luck and death. In the sense, his name calls attention to an ill fate, one that would lead to an end not befitting of one who sacrificed much so others wouldn't have to. Much of how the shinobi operates can be seen through one who ushered Itachi down a path that would lead him to his own end, and branded him a killer as a consequence. The one who behind the scenes ruled over the system's enforcers, and yet still desired to further his own ends even in a world far removed from the one that created him, Danzo Shimura. Having served as a founder of the Anbu subsidiary, Danzo did much. Though underhanded and immoral his actions may have been, Danzo only ever acted in what he believed were the village's best interests, as that was the shinobi way. But that assertion was misguided and only led to suffering. Danzo made his allies from young shinobi who had potential, whose worldviews had not been filtered by Sarutobi's naivete. But it was Sarutobi's judgment that retained Itachi's trust and loyalty, which would then lead to the unraveling of the Akatsuki's intentions after Naruto's failed capture. While Danzo's actions in service of the Leaf would lead to Nagato's hatred of Konoha and ultimately to its destruction, Danzo possessed an arbitrary adherence to the ideals of a shinobi, believing that one must sacrifice everything for the village. Personal hypocrisy aside, it was in this belief that he viewed Itachi as a true shinobi, a belief that was convenient to his own interests. But what was true of Itachi's place as a shinobi was his role as a tool to be used for the interests of those above. And thus, in his withering mind, Itachi was presented with a false dilemma which led him down a path of darkness, a path he never truly walked of his own volition. And yet, even in the midst of that tragic fate, he never even considered severing that which weighed upon his identity. In his death, Itachi had planned for Sasuke to be the hero of the Uchiha, so the hatred and bad blood which were so synonymous with the Uchiha name would die with him and be birthed anew with Sasuke at the helm. To achieve this, he wanted Sasuke to know hatred, so he pushed him towards a path of hatred that he never intended for him to go so far down. because he did not want Sasuke to become a tool. And yet, even believing that, even knowing the consequences of hatred and conflict in a world tethered to that reality as it was, he couldn't realize that Sasuke had become a tool, his own. Itachi had turned Sasuke into a tool by virtue of not allowing him to make his own choices in seeing the world as it is, just as the Leaf and the Uchiha had done. In Sasuke's despair, he was unable to reach the understanding that Itachi had tried to guide him to. In assuming that Sasuke would follow the path he'd set out, Itachi inadvertently fell into the ignorance he fought against, not realizing that he'd made his brother a tool to be used by those who would have use for that hatred. Itachi was not perfect, not as a ninja and not as a person. His motives were well reasoned, but there were cracks in his logic which led to an even worse fate for the one he tried to protect. Though Sasuke had become strong through knowing hatred, he was always at the mercy of those who tried to use that hatred to destroy what Itachi had sacrificed everything for. Thank you for watching.